The figure of Aleksandr Makedonsky is shrouded in hundreds of legends and myths. His tomb is still being searched for to this day. His feats and empire have left an indelible mark on history. What makes him so famous? Why is he still admired to this day? And what in the legends is true and what is myth? Hello everyone, this is Aleksandr of and we'll start with a lyrical digression. Many subscribers like my 5-part investigation, The Mysterious City. But despite this, many people were left with the feeling that something was left unsaid. And I did promise to release a sequel, but somehow I just never got around to it. And so I decided to continue my thoughts after all and tie together the many loose ends left in the investigation. But, as is usually the case, the deeper you dig into the topic, the more new details keep coming up. And now I'm not even sure I'll be able to fit everything into just one episode. So make yourself comfortable and grab some cookies. The story will be long and definitely not in just one episode. This time, we'll use Wikipedia only as a fact-checking tool. And for the main source, we'll rely on the original, Plutarch, and his comparative biographies of Alexander and Caesar. And one more small but very important note before we begin. Yes, I know that neither the originals of Plutarch nor even his copies have survived to our time. And all of this looks very much like a forgery, and Plutarch can't really be trusted at all. But if we just say that all of this is nonsense and a fabrication, without backing it up with facts, then how will we be any different from those whom we accuse of forgery? So for now, let's just take the official history at its word. And as we study it further, we'll start to notice inconsistencies and illogical points. Well, that's everything just the way we like it. I'll use the translation by Botvinnik and Perlmutter as the basis, published by Pravda in 1987, Volume 2. And my entire further narration will be based on quoting Plutarch. And as the narration progresses, we'll be amazed together. Well, that's it for the introduction, and now we can move on to the story. From the very first lines, Plutarch, just like me, by the way, warns the reader that because of
the multitude of events
that have to be considered, we did not give these biographies a new introduction.
Besides the request,
we ask the readers not to blame us for not listing all the famous deeds of these people. We will not examine each of them in detail, and our account will mostly be brief. We are not writing a history but a biography, and virtue or vice is not always evident in the most glorious deeds. But often some insignificant act, word, or joke reveals a person's character better than battles, where tens of thousands perish, commanding huge armies and besieging cities. Just as artists, paying little attention to other parts of the body, achieve likeness through the precise depiction of the face and the expression of the eyes in which a person's character is revealed. So, let us also be allowed to delve into the study of the signs that reflect a person's soul, and on this basis compose each biography, leaving it to others to sing of great deeds and battles. The origin of Aleksandr raises no disputes. On his father's side, he traced his lineage from Heracles through Coran, and on his mother's side from Aak through Neoptolemus. It is reported that Philip was initiated into the Samothracian mysteries at the same time as Olympiada, when he himself was still a youth, and she was a girl who had lost her parents. Philip fell in love with her and married her, having obtained the consent of her brother Ariba. However, the love between Philip and Olympiada did not last long. On the eve of their very first wedding night, Olympiada told him what she had seen, as if a lightning bolt struck her in the womb, and from that strike a strong fire flared up. Immediately, many began to suspect her of infidelity, while Philip had another dream in which he seemed to be sealing his wife's womb. One night, they even saw a snake, supposedly lying along the body of the sleeping Olympiada. In addition, it turned out that in Olympiada's homeland, girls very often take part in Orphic mysteries and orgies in honor of Dionysus. The participants of these mysteries are called sorceresses, and Olympiada was almost the most zealous participant in such orgies. As Plutarch says, she behaved at them in a completely barbaric manner, and she also liked to carry large tame snakes, which frightened those around her. All this sharply cooled Philip's romantic passion, and over time he distanced himself from her. By the way, one of the many oddities is connected with this, namely, the oracle of Apollo prescribed to him
To offer sacrifices.
to the god Ammon and to honor him more than the others. Aleksandr was born on the same day when the temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned down. Plutarch puts special emphasis on this and says that all the magi and sorcerers shouted that this day had brought great misfortune to Asia. However, his father Philip was lucky 3 times that day. First, his army won a great victory over the Illyrians. Second, his horse won at the Olympic Games. And third, a son was born to him. From early childhood, Aleksandr was very ambitious, intelligent, and discerning. His indifference to physical pleasures, along with his ambition and intelligence, made him unusually serious and noble for a child. Every time news came that Philip had conquered some famous city or won a glorious victory, Aleksandr would become gloomy upon hearing it and say to his peers, "Boys, my father will manage to conquer everything, so there will be nothing great or brilliant left for me to accomplish with you." Aleksandr's education was overseen by the greatest minds of that time, and his main tutor was Aristotle. He also taught him medicine, as well as the so-called secret oral knowledge. His favorite book at that time became the Iliad by Homer, a copy of which he always carried with him. When Aleksandr turned 16, his father went to conquer the city of Byzantium, which is now Istanbul. But because the Athenians were constantly providing the city with help by sea, the siege failed. At the same time, 16-year-old Aleksandr remained as the temporary ruler of Macedonia, and taking command of the reserve army ensured a reliable rear for his father. As a result, Aleksandr subdued the rebels. They were the Medes. In some translations, they are called the Mises. He captured their city, the name of which Plutarch does not mention, renamed it Alexandropolis, and settled Greeks there. Let's put the first marker at this place. The battle that Plutarch talks about happened suddenly on the river, Ister or Istra. Now, there is no such river in this area.
No, there isn't either.
Nor are there any remains or mentions of the city Alexandropol. However, on some maps, Apollonia is present, located approximately in the same place as modern Burgas. And the only river that even remotely fits the description is the Danube, which, by the way, used to be called Istris. Where is Alexandropol? Where did it go? Did it turn into Burgas, or is it somewhere else? But it's too early to draw conclusions, so let's move on. Thanks to the victories of his son and the defeat of Alexander's father, even then the Macedonians began to call him their king, while his father was considered only a commander. Despite this, Philip was very happy for his son, but from that moment on, everything started to go wrong. Olympiada, who did not let Philip near her, nevertheless turned out to be very jealous and angry, constantly turning her son against his father. I won't bore you with the details of the quarrels that arose between father and son, as the French say. If you want to find the reason, look for the woman, as Charchelly says. And if there are 3 of them, then trouble is inevitable. As a result of a quarrel with his son, Philippus exiled his son's friends Harpalus, Nearchus, Origus, and Ptolemaeus beyond the borders of Macedonia, which the conspirators took advantage of by killing Philippus. Many later blamed both Alexander himself and his mother, Olympias, for this. However, Alexander tracked down all the participants in the conspiracy and executed them. So, at the age of 20, Alexander received a kingdom that, because of the strong envy and terrible hatred of its neighbors, was threatened with dangers from all sides. The barbarian tribes did not want to be slaves, but sought to restore the royal power that had originally existed among them. As for Greece, Philip, who had subdued it by force of arms, had not succeeded in making the Greeks submit and obediently bear their fate. It was necessary, without wasting any time, to pacify the rebellious Greek provinces, and the first of them was the city of Thebes. Alexander approached with a large army and proposed to hand over only 2 conspirators. To the rest he promised forgiveness and immunity in exchange for repentance. However, the Thebans became so emboldened that they began calling on Alexander's army to switch to their side. That was a fatal mistake. Alexander began the assault, and after a fierce battle, the details of which we will also omit, he sacked the city and wiped it off the face of the earth. As a result, more than 6,000 Thebans were killed, and over 30,000 were sold into slavery. Only a few kept their lives in freedom, and only by a miracle. After this, Alexander regretted what he had done for a very long time, and this event had a strong influence on his subsequent actions. After all, he tried to be as merciful as possible to the defeated enemies. Gathering on the narrow isthmus separating Laconia, Sparta, and Athens, called the Isthmus, the Greeks proclaimed Alexander their king and approved his desire to march against Persia. And also, after this, peace was made with the Athenians. Yes, not just peace. Alexander forgave the Athenians all their offenses and ordered them to watch over the state of affairs in Greece while he would be on campaign. And if something happened to him, it was the Athenians who were declared the successors of Alexander. So, peace in his own kingdom was achieved, and it was possible to prepare for the campaign. In Alexander's army, according to various sources, there were between 30 and 43,000 infantrymen and between 4 and 5,000 cavalrymen. Before the campaign, Alexander gave away all his property, settling villages among his friends and relatives, leaving himself with resources for only 30 days. When one of his friends, Perdiccas, exclaimed, "So, King, what are you leaving for yourself? Only hopes?" Alexander replied, "In that case, we who are going with you want to have a share in those hopes," said Perdiccas, and he refused the property that had been given to him. And some of Alexander's friends followed his example. With such determination and such thoughts, Alexander crossed the Hellespont. At this point, we will pause again and conduct another detailed analysis. Because, if up to this point everything has more or less formed a single picture, here is where the most interesting part begins. Let's take another look at the map of the area and recall the previous events. Father Aleksandr was unable to take Byzantium, which stood on the coast of the strait, but that was because it was supported by the Athenians. Now, however, the Athenians have sworn allegiance to Aleksandr, so nothing stands in his way to take it. Moreover, judging by the consensus reached at Itme, Byzantium was supposed to voluntarily switch to Alexander's side. Most likely that's what happened, as it was impossible to leave an enemy behind your lines. And secondly, that's the narrowest part of the strait, only 900 meters wide, and the shores are quite friendly. That is, the crossing could be made, if not instantly, then very quickly. Instead, Alexander crosses from the other side of the Hellespont, also at a narrow spot, but the width of the strait there is almost twice as much, about 1.5 kilometers. In addition, the 45,000 strong army, together with its baggage train, had to march more than 50 kilometers along a narrow isthmus only 4.5 kilometers wide, well, to the crossing point. If there had been even the simplest observation tower on the other bank, the entire opposite shore would have been clearly visible for 50 kilometers. For a huge army, this is a 2-day march, or a forced march that takes 1 day, but then you need to add rest after the march. So the Persians had at least a day, but most likely 3 days, to learn about Alexander's plans and
to react. Besides,
in addition, crossing is quite a difficult task. And if at that very moment an enemy garrison approaches, it will be able to successfully prevent the landing with relatively small forces, and even completely thwart it simply by sinking or disabling most of the vessels. Such a crossing would have to be either lightning fast with a large number of vessels, which takes a lot of time to prepare and organize, making the invasion quite noticeable. Well, or it should be preceded by some kind of naval artillery bombardment, as is done now to disorganize the coastal garrison and make the landing easier. And again, I ask myself, why exactly here? And why was there no battle or any resistance at all? However, Plutarch doesn't mention anything like that. He simply crossed over, as if he had just taken an elevator ride. In general, crossing a river is such a tedious task, especially if the enemy is strong, that it would be more logical to just go around the Black Sea from the other side. And by the way, why did Aleksandr so passionately decide to go after the Persians in particular? Why didn't he just go around the Black Sea coast, capturing the Scythians and the entire coastline along the way? That would be more profitable, the lands are richer. Next, we get a possible explanation from Plutarch. Alexander's first wish was to visit Ilion, which is now called Troy. There, he supposedly wandered around the city like a tourist, got acquainted with the sights, made offerings to Athena and libations to the heroes. He visited the tomb of Achilles, paid his respects by running naked around the monument and laying a wreath. This is a quote from Plutarch, just so you know. By the way, speaking of quotes, later Plutarch writes a strange phrase that I still can't understand. The provided text may be incorrectly translated or missing context. Please share your thoughts in the comments. When the king was passing through Ilion and looking at the sights, someone asked him if he wanted to see Lyra Alexandrovna. The king replied that he was not interested in her at all. John is looking for Lyra Aquila, to the sound of which he sang the glory and feats of valiant men. What kind of lyra is that? It's like some kind of self-playing gusly or a prehistoric tape recorder, and Achille was singing about someone besides himself. He actually wrote poetry. I don't really remember any mention of it in the Iliad. In general, it seems like all the words are familiar, but when you start to really think about it, the meaning of what's being said just slips away. Wouldn't you agree? In other words, Aleksandr wasn't in a hurry at all, and after crossing over, felt as if he were in an enemy city, but acted just like a modern tourist. He walked around, looked at things, had a meal, enjoyed the sights, and took photos for memories. Meanwhile, Darius's commanders gathered a large army and positioned it at the crossing of the Granicus River, expecting a battle. Well, large is relative. It was actually half the size of Alexander's army. According to Plutarch, the battle was inevitable, for this place was like the gateway to Asia, and to begin the invasion, they had to fight for the right to enter. However, many were frightened by the depth,
the river, the steepness,
and the steepness of the opposite bank, which had to be taken by force. Actually, Wikipedia says the same thing, and all the maps mention this battle as the first and one of the most important. But we, as usual, won't just take their word for it, and will try to find this place ourselves. Fortunately, technology now allows us to do so. So, from the quote by Plutarch,
We understand.
that first, Alexander had nowhere else to go but here. Second, the river was deep and fast. And third, the banks were steep and even rocky. Plutarch will mention this a bit later in a quote. He led his troops toward the enemy's spears and arrows.
To the steep cliffs.
Cliffs strewn with enemy infantry and cavalry across the river, whose current swept away horses and covered the riders over their heads. Moreover, while vividly describing the ensuing battle, Plutarch repeatedly mentions the clayey shore, the cliffs, and also suddenly refers to Darius's warriors as barbarians. Out of naivety, I got used to the idea that we, the Rus, are the ones called barbarians. But here it turns out the Persians, the strongest army in the world at that time, one of the most enlightened civilizations, are called barbarians. In general, if you want a vivid description of this battle, read Plutarch. It's chapter 16 in the aforementioned book. But I want to find the actual location of the battle, according to the description. So, the Granicus River, flowing from south to north, let's find it on the map of modern Turkey. And let's be honest, it's not impressive. The river is so small that I had to use the method of one researcher to trace its route on the maps. Otherwise, it's simply not visible. The width of the river is no more than 10 to 12 meters, and at first glance, the current isn't very strong either. Well, after all, even now there are trees growing along the banks. I'm certainly not much of a strategist, am I? But is it really that hard to cut 12-meter-long planks and logs and quickly organize a pontoon bridge, or even 10 bridges at once? With a bridge that long, no special construction skills are needed. Simply lay down a log and you're done. And it won't take much time either. And to those who say, well, it's impossible to do that under fire, I'll ask in return, is it really much easier to cross a raging stream on horseback under fire? But now the route is mapped out, and now you can look for a place that fits the description. And you know what? I didn't find the cliffs of the rocky shores. No, really, the terrain in Turkey is quite hilly, and the elevation changes are quite significant. But right in the places where this stream flows, it's mostly flatlands. There's only one place that's more or less suitable according to the description. Here it is. But again, questions arise. Plutarch reports that Darius's warriors fired at the crossing from the rocks, but here there are mostly steep hills. But even in this case, I don't understand why the Persians didn't take the shore and throw spears at the crossing Macedonians,
But just stood.
far away, just shooting at them. And they joined the battle only after Alexander crossed over with his cavalry. But even that's not the strangest thing. According to Plutarch's account, there was no other way to enter Persia except for this road. However, satellite images tell us something different. This place could have been bypassed from any side. Moreover, logically, Alexander should have moved precisely along the sea, capturing port cities where the main wealth and trade centers were concentrated. Instead, he chose the only unsuitable place for crossing, and in the most mountainous area, moreover, 60 kilometers away from the landing site. Moreover, even without crossing this river, he could have easily reached the coast of either the Black Sea or the Mediterranean Sea. To seize full control over the Marmara and leave the Persians with the lifeless mountains. In any direction, both to the right and to the left, there were wealthy cities and fertile lands, and much closer than the site of the upcoming battle. Tactically and strategically, I just don't understand the logic of Alexander and the Persians. But after that, after the clash, everything went as it should. Immediately after this battle, many Persian cities submitted to him without a fight. Alexander immediately took control of the main coastal stronghold of the empire, Sardis. Now this city is Izmir. That is, he returned to the sea, although he could have gone straight along the coast to Sardis. and again. I don't understand why. Plutarch insists that the crossing at Granicus was the only way into Persia. After everything I've read and seen,
It creates the impression
that in Persia, there was simply no one there. Alexander easily crosses the sea and conquers hundreds of kilometers of territory without a fight. And in the only battle he faces, it's against a hastily assembled army half the size of his own, which Plutarch repeatedly calls barbarians. Plutarch insists that Alexander could not have simply passed by the Persians. This means that on both sides there were not just mountains, but impassable mountains, at least for infantry and cavalry. It must have been a gorge like Thermopylae, where, thanks to the narrowness of the passage, a small detachment of Spartans was able to withstand the huge Persian army. Such passes are usually called gates to a certain region. In the specified area, there simply are no such gates. It was possible to bypass the battlefield without much difficulty from either side. Moreover, it was possible to distract the enemy by deploying half the army along the shore as if preparing to cross. And in the meantime, the other half could calmly cross either upstream, downstream, or at both places, right away, so that later they could attack from the rear, and with a sudden strike and minimal losses, crush the enemy army to dust. However, if we assume that the action took place in another location, that changes everything. Section: Fierce Speculations, Wild Theories, and Malicious Witchcraft. Crossing the Hellespont. I've already voiced some doubts about the crossing above, but there are more. The thing is, the very origin of the word Hellespont is rather unclear. Subconsciously, we understand that pont means sea. We've all seen this word on ancient maps, but I haven't found the word pont in any language, neither in Latin nor in Greek. Wikipedia says that only the ancient Greeks used this name, and only for the Black Sea. However, let's take a closer look. The Black Sea was called Pontus Euxinus. That is, all seas are called mare as seas, but this one is not mare, it's Pontus, and moreover, Euxinus. Then they hit us with the fact that Pontus is not even a sea at all, but a Turkish coastal territory on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. Checkmate, alternative thinkers. And the final blow to the head, this is the Pontic Kingdom. Well, let's suppose. However, a large ancient Greek-Russian dictionary calls not only the Black Sea, but also the Mediterranean Sea Pontos. And the Wiki dictionary, although it doesn't say anything useful, somewhere at the end modestly writes that in ancient Greek this word meant the Sea of Thucydides. Such fragments of unrefined knowledge stick out everywhere. The main thing is to notice them. Well, for example, the word pontoon. How did it originate? Not a single dictionary says anything useful. However, all pontoons have one thing in common: some kind of structure on the water. And in English, the prefix on actually means on. So pontoon is literally translated as on the water. By the way, Pontos Euxinus, in translation from ancient Greek, means the hospitable sea. Anyway, I've really gone off topic. But all I really needed to do was prove that the word pont means sea in ancient Greek. I hope my evidence is enough for you, and for the really stubborn ones, I'll make a separate video on this topic sometime. Now let's look at the second part. The word Galaes doesn't seem to mean anything, but if you write it in Latin, then
the letter G.
Here it turns into I. If we add the Latin letter C to it, then such a combination of letters will eventually give us the letter Q. And with this letter, everything becomes clear and simple. Hellespont, that is, across the sea. In other words, Hellespont is simply the word for strait in ancient Greek. And if you think I just made fun of the word, look at how translators twist and mock it. It is written here in black and white that Kales is a strait in ancient Greek. And right here, with a straight face, it is added that only the Hellespont is meant and nothing else. In general, nevertheless, we understand that this is a narrow strait, a channel connecting two seas of Pontus, and the real name of this strait is Bosphorus, that is, Hellespont Bosphorus. But why then didn't Plutarch specify which Hellespont he meant? After all, there are others too. Just like Bosporus, it actually might not refer to a specific place, but simply to a peninsula or the junction of two protruding landmasses separated by a narrow strait, the Hellespont. All of this would sound like the ravings of a madman if Bosporus was the only one. However, the place where Aleksandr supposedly crossed is called the Thracian Bosporus, but there are at least two more Bosporuses, and one of them is unexpectedly the Tauric Bosporus. It also separates two seas, Pontus and the Kerch Strait, and it could very well also be called the Hellespont across the sea. Another advantage of this particular isthmus is that the army's approach to the crossing at this place would not be visible from afar, unlike in the case of the Thracian Bosporus. And it immediately becomes clear why the sea was crossed exactly at this place and not in the area of Byzantium. And by the way, there is also, or rather there was, the Istra River here, but we'll talk about it in other episodes. So, crossing the Kerch Strait or the Hellespont of Nameless, we see to our left, to the north, Taganrog with its ancient Troitskaya fortress, which doesn't need to be renamed to Troy, it's already Troitskaya. And to the right are the Caucasus Mountains, among which there are many turbulent mountain streams, pressed on both sides by cliffs in the sea. And right here, all the conditions exist to block the road. Well, for example, the Sochi River would be quite suitable, well, as an option, although there are a lot of such rivers here. And again, this is also a road to Persia, only a land route. On this crazy note, let's probably finish the first part of the story. But the truly mind-blowing part is yet to come. And one more nuance. In this research, I am telling the story using Plutarch as the main source. However, there are other sources as well. For example, Diodorus Siculus. If you are interested in all points of view, it is Diodorus Siculus who covers the Labyrinth Channel in a very good and detailed way in his Histories. Take a look at it sometime in your free time. Well, I have a continuation coming up. Friends, none of us are immune to mistakes. And if you see a flaw in my logic, don't hesitate. Clearly, correctly, and without stumbling, leave your angry comment under the video. Subtitles created by Subtitles.